It's an honor to welcome you to the second panel of our convention titled Extending Realities, Generating New Forms of Knowledge about the Past. Today we embark with two incredible guests on an exciting journey at the crossroads of history, technology, and human connection. This topic holds a special place in my heart as someone truly passionate about cultural heritage and new technologies. Over the past 7 years at Opuscope, our mission was to providing tools for creative minds and accelerating the transition to the immersive era. Our mission has always been to amplify stories and create spaces for better engagement and sharing, which aligns perfectly with the theme of today's panel. The internet has offered a new era where collaboration and participation transcend boundaries. It's not just about sharing history, it's about co-creating it. Archives, museums, and universities are no longer static repositories of history. They have evolved into dynamic spaces that leverage collective intelligence. They draw upon the accounts and memories generously shared by individuals through social media, game forums, and various digital tools. These collaborations bridge the realms of analog and digital, providing a platform for voices that were once overlooked and unheard. Our panel, Extending Realities, celebrates the power of participatory and collaborative eCommemoration, where the traditional reading of history undergoes a profound transformation. Today, we are honored to have two remarkable speakers who have made significant contributions to this transformative field. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Katrina Kiefer, a cultural historian whose work extends our understanding of history through game. You can join us on stage. Thank you. You can pick. And Lanier Spruce, a social creative who connects cultural institutions and brands with diverse audiences through storytelling on social media. Thank you. Thank you. Together, we will explore their groundbreaking project, delve into the evolution of digital historytelling, and discuss the critical role of active audience participation in reshaping our understanding of the past. Thank you.
Okay, shall I?
Yes. So let's begin with the project of Katrina, Bunce Island Through the Mirrors.
Okay, so as mentioned, I'm a cultural historian of West Africa, specifically Sierra Leone. And a number of years ago, I began working on new ways of bringing digital innovation to this particular realm of the humanities. For those who are not necessarily familiar with Sierra Leone, it's a small country in West Africa. It was at one point considered the heart of the British West African Empire. It is a remarkable and amazing country, and I seriously will go on about it forever, given half a chance, and so I have to be really good and pace myself. The game itself that I've been building with my team and with brilliant collaborators and creatives within Sierra Leone really begins and focuses on Bunce Island itself, the slave fort at Bunce, which is really tiny. So if you look at that image, you may see there's an island upriver, and it's sort of a squarish looking one. That's not Bunce, that's Tasso Island. The little teeny tiny speck just past it, that's Bunce. Oh. Bunce is less than 1 kilometer long. It was extremely active between the 17th and 19th centuries. It's a complicated place, which I'll get into under questions, and again, we'll have to occasionally stop myself. In the real world, Bunce Island Fort has been being preserved and reshaped to allow tourism, to allow people to reconnect with very traumatic and difficult pasts. One of the things that we've been trying to do is, in collaboration with communities in Sierra Leone, firstly to digitize that space, and to work with community elders and to make sure that people are comfortable with how we're digitizing it, but also to do so that the diaspora, the people beyond Bunce, beyond this, can reconnect with their past. So in order to do this, this is a screenshot from within the game. That's an image of the Great House. We worked with We Own TV, which is a Freetown-based media company, allowed us to conduct photogrammetry. We've worked with international scholars who include prominent archaeologists such as Christopher de Course, and many, many anthropologists, archaeologists, and historians to try and reconstruct the island in a way that we have a ton of data and also that it's immersive, engaging, and visually very, very interesting. The full game, which I'll speak about later on, is considerably more ambitious, but this version, this demo, we promoted in May at the Federation for the Humanities Congress in Canada in Toronto, and it received tremendous interest, and the model that we seem to be building in terms of community collaboration is one that many other scholars and creatives are now reaching out to us because they'd like to see more stuff with that. So I hope that was sufficiently short.
It is. Thank you very much.
All right. I'm Lene. Nice to meet everybody. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about my work at the Smithsonian National Museum, African American History and Culture. All right, so let's get into it. This is one of the Giphies that we made a really long time ago. The story of this museum really started, it was a century in the making, and there was a huge movement to build a dedicated space for African Americans on the mall in Washington, D.C. With that effort, the museum opened to its doors to the public in 2016 on September 23rd. And I remember a moment when I was on Twitter and I saw this photo of President Obama at this groundbreaking for this museum. And I tweeted, wow, this is really awesome. And I would love to be here someday. 2 weeks later, I got a call from a recruiter, and somehow I was hired to begin to build a digital community for something that didn't technically exist yet. I know, this was my face too. So I was trying to figure out where to get started. I think I was very new to the museum field. I was not a person that had gone to museums before, so I really didn't understand this enormous task that was before me, which in hindsight was probably good. This sticky note here was given to me by my old boss, and we asked, how do we honor African American experiences outside the common narrative? And I think for me, this was kind of an aha moment where I said, that's it, this is how we should approach social. I think at the time, a lot of the platforms like Twitter was still in its infancy phase. Instagram had just started, but it wasn't quite big yet. And this was an opportunity for us to explore something that was pretty deep. And with that, social can be a humanizing voice of cultural institutions, museums, and brands. And for us, it was really important to find our voice on social and to figure out how can we show up and contribute to the conversations, but also allow us to start to pique interest and develop a new way to tell stories about American history through the African American lens. And that was our reason to exist. Because social is not always friendly to people who aren't people, right? So institutions, museums, and brands. And our North Star was really around engaging our community, and it serves as a focal point for expression and people interested in the African American story. And we use discovery, shared knowledge, and daily conversations to rally people. And that was our North Star, amplify stories that exist outside the common narrative of American history. We had 3 goals to win. Use social with a focus on the social, creating a virtual space for people to ask questions, consider issues, and exchange ideas. We wanted to empower our audience to contribute to the national discussion on race and history, so that meant we were asking provoking questions on Twitter. But we also just hosted a space for people to also tag us and ask us questions as well. And then we just wanted to inspire our audience to remember, value, and share local and family and African American history. So how could we create conversations and trending topics that allow people to not only contribute to what we were doing through our work, but also to tell their own stories as well, through their own unique lenses. And then we really just wanted to foster relationships that expanded the reach of the museum beyond our walls. I think sometimes museums can be very insular, and our goal was to show up in places that were unexpected for museums. And we did that in quite a few different ways. So that really was the way that we made meaning through our hashtag A People's Journey, which was really about the journey of the African American story throughout history, and a nation story where we really started to examine some more difficult topics and ways to insert the African American story in a different way. One way we would do that was to create a connection between the physical experience and the digital community. So we hosted the first ever experiential museum for our grand opening weekend. And then we also just wanted to include multiple sides to historical stories. So we talked about Reese Taylor. We were able to put a different spin on the July 4th by actually taking this Lonnie Bunch, director of the museum, taking a tour through our galleries. And then we also created this hashtag called Hidden Her Story, where we amplify the stories of Black women throughout history. I think oftentimes their contributions are undervalued and not shared. And we were able to really amplify them in a way that finds a spotlight. Then we also just use objects from our collection and other collections to just tell a different side of history. So one of the cool things we did was we hosted a rap battle among the Smithsonian museums, and Lin-Manuel Miranda actually jumped in and spit a few bars, which was a really fun moment. And you can see here, there's a tweet where the actual Smithsonian channel started a rap bar, and then other museums were able to jump in. Then we also just really tried to celebrate daily life as well as the triumphs and tragedies of history and culture. And we were able to do that in a couple of different ways. One of these stories here I really loved because people hadn't heard it. And every time we get comments from people like, I didn't know that, tell me more, like it just made the job really interesting. So that's everything that I just said right here in one. And yeah, here's all my info if you want to stay in touch. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lenny. My first question is for you. When did you first realize in your career that digital history telling could expand your understanding of reality?
Wow. It started very early on, I think, when we were starting to think about how to approach digital. For us, it was a question of how do we start to make some of the conversations that were missing in online, and also some of the stories that museums tell, how do we start to tell this in a different way? So for me, it started from that very first moment when we sat down and we said, you know, this is how we're going to define our voice, because we were tasked with getting people excited for something that didn't technically exist. So our lens into the world was through social media. So we were able to use our social to create a space that people could get excited about, that they can contribute to. But also something that was, I think, a little bit different was that we really focused on humanizing the African American story. When I started in the museum field, all I would see on social at the time was photos of objects. Okay. So what we were able to do was to take those objects and flip it on its head and really use stories of people. And if you still look at the museum's Instagram account, it's more typically photos of people. And we were able to share that and get them excited around something in a different way. And it really, I think, allowed people to connect more with African American history and to see themselves in it through common themes that we know, like resilience and family and just a love of history and culture, too.
Okay. Is that something you want to add to that answer, or?
I mean, I think it's been an interesting experience because I grew up as a gamer, and so I've always, I mean, I was playing on a VIC-20 and a C64 in the early 1980s, and so gaming and the digital world have always been a part of my conception of everything. And yet, for some reason, I always kept my academic and scholarly pursuits really separate from that in this weird, confused way. And then my university, actually, my fabulous chair, reached out to me and was like, hey, would you like to teach game studies? And I remember being like, is that a thing? Why did I do history? What was I thinking? Anyway, I mean, I really do love history, but I was delighted by game studies. And so I taught that, and I still didn't put the two together. And even though I was doing digital humanities research, my very first project had to do with attempting to use machine learning to help those who were descended from enslaved Africans to trace their origins through studying and interpreting the patterns of facial scarification, which if we could actually train an algorithm to read like optical character generation, then that meant that even if people were taken far from home, renamed multiple times, if we have manumission papers, runaway slave ads, anything, country marks, it means we know where someone's from. So that was a really cool thing. So I was still, I was thinking, how do we bring the digital into this? And then that turned into, okay, well, no one has apparently ever created a digital catalog that includes slave traders' brands. So even if we find marks with TCR on the chest, who is that? And no one had ever done that. And I was like, okay, who do I give this data to? And they were like, oh, no one's done that. And I was like, okay, project 2, let's go. So I've sort of fallen into it, and then it was only in when the pandemic kicked in, that I suddenly brought the gaming to my digital advocacy and smooshed them together and was like, oh my gosh, data visualization plus.
Yeah. To continue on this subject, at what stages of your project did you feel the need to collaborate with partners outside your usual academic or museum cycle? So it's a question for both of you. And how has this impacted your view of history and storytelling?
I would say we had to collaborate from the very beginning because we didn't have a space. So a lot of our public programs were hosted at some of the sister museums, like American History or Natural History or whatever it was. But then also, I think it was important for me, again, really trying to insert the museum and make it accessible for an entirely new group of people, to partner with organizations like Giphy and do like a gift party on Twitter, or to work with Spotify and do a pop-up museum exhibition in New York City, or even partnering with other museums online and doing a tweet-a-thon about a subject matter in Black history. Like, we've always collaborated with other institutions, and I think that has helped to really, again, bring new people into the museum field. People like me who weren't used to going and who didn't really see themselves in this space. And I'm really proud of the way that we were able to do that.
Perfect.
Yeah, same thing, basically. Really from the beginning. I mean, bottom line, I'm a white chick from Canada. This is the work that I do. It's peripherally my story because my ancestors participated in the worst possible ways. But ultimately, it's not my story. I shouldn't be at the center of it. And so from the very get-go, I was constantly looking to, how do I ensure that people in the communities that are most directly affected by this, how do they feel about my work, and am I doing the work that I should be doing? And that means not centering, as I sit in the center of a stage. But particularly with Bunce Island took that to a whole new level, because I began to fall down rabbit holes constantly as I was doing the research. And I realized, there's absolutely limits to what I can say. I'm a cultural historian who works on body marking and the transatlantic slave trade, particularly in Sierra Leone. Cool, I can go on about that forever. But what I realized was that if I want to reconstruct the Sierra Leone estuary circa 1720, my first problem was buttons. And it was like, okay, wait, what are these European dudes holding their pants up with? If I'm going to digitally recreate that, would it be rope or suspenders or buttons? I'm not sure. And this was well outside my own knowledge. So I started off by talking to reenactors. And so I ended up really relying on two groups beyond academia, one of whom were community members within Sierra Leone and creatives within Sierra Leone, whose story this fundamentally is. And for practical questions in terms of digital reconstruction, I've discovered that people who don't have letters behind their names but have this tremendous passion and have preserved these knowledge types have been absolutely extraordinary and very generous with their time. Naval reenactors, shout out to Tom Hurlbut, awesome guy, who gave me the most incredible, wonderful conversation around just how does a naval battle actually work?
Yeah.
Because he's done those. And most of the scholars I knew had never actually done those. So
I want to piggyback off something you said. You talked about inviting the community in, and I think I missed that when we said that. So we also were able to I think, open the space up to a whole new group of people. We built out an influencer program in this very early stages of social before people wanted millions of dollars to do posts and tweets. And it was important for us that they were able to also give us feedback on experiences with the museum. Like, come here, get an early view on this. Do you like this? We surveyed our audience every 2 years as well, just to see, hey, is this working for you? Are we doing something that you're missing out on? And I think that's crucial. There's a lot of museums that just talk at people, but invite people in to also figure out like what they want from you. It's so important when you're trying to build a community space that it's not just one-sided.
Totally.
And why is community representation important in developing games? Because it's something we don't really thought about before.
I think for me it's because it gets to the fundamental question of whose story is it? And who should be having the story told, and who, ultimately, the question of authorship. You know, when I'm telling a story or I'm facilitating the storytelling that's taking place, in order to tell the story that we're telling about Bunce, I have a brilliant team of students who've done phenomenal archival work, and we've teased out actual historical figures so that we can follow their really unique and interesting stories. But how do those stories fit into the Sierra Leone cultural heritage? If I'm not engaging with people in Sierra Leone actively and finding out, is this the story you want to have told? And if I'm going astray in some way, again, it's not my story. So to me, that's sort of a core value about developing games and ensuring that a game holds that authenticity, but holds that deeper meaning as well.
Yes, and actually that's a question we want to ask you in the audience and online. Who should be able to tell the stories and profit from game, and why? So you can go on the AHA slide application that we used yesterday and answer if you have a thought about it. And if you want to answer to that question, Katrina or Lani.
I mean, one thing I will add to that on the profit side of things, this is something that my team and I felt very, very strongly about as well. One of the problems that we initially had was if we're digitizing Bunce Island, which the Sierra Leonean government and the Monuments and Relics Commission is actively working to preserve because Ghana had tremendous success with their Year of Return. There's a lot of people who want to have very profound emotional reconnection experiences whose ancestors were enslaved. If we do a really great job of digitizing Bunce, did we just kind of screw over Sierra Leone? And that was a fundamental problem for us was, okay, wait, hang on. We're trying to make this space more accessible for members of the diaspora. We're trying to make this more accessible for people who don't have the financial resources to fly to Sierra Leone. But we want to motivate people to benefit Sierra Leone as well. And the flip side, we realized the best solution to this was if we monetize the game, then our declaration is that 1/3 of all profits go back directly to the community members who've participated in creating the game. 1/3 goes to the creative sector in Sierra Leone to help fund scholarships and allow students at, for example, Central University in Sierra Leone to be able to pursue their dreams and to help the people of that country do what they want to do. So we're trying to ensure that the profits are returning back and benefiting people so that we're not screwing over the very country that we're trying to help tell a story for.
Thank you. We have many answers. Funny one. That's the first answer we received. And many of you talked about communities, individuals, people who are happy to share profit with the local community. Yes. The affected ones, everyone, community, experts of the topic. Okay, we'll gather all these of those answers. Thank you. We will now that we better understand the importance of knowledge with cooperation, let's deep dive into our second part, provoking reactions. And how can we implement participation in digital history telling? So my first question is for you, Katrina. Why is it important to involve the audience in your historical experiences? And what difficulties have you faced in achieving this?
So I think it's important to involve the audience, and this is where games are wonderful because of their fundamentally immersive nature. They're not a passive tool of consumption. Because when I'm talking about the transatlantic slave trade or African history, one of the fundamental problems is that in game spaces and in most pop culture spaces, people often don't think about the African continent. I often say to my students that there's a big question mark in your head and it's the size of a continent, which is also a pun on the shape of the continent. But it's true, and I think it's really important to get people immersed, to get people reflecting, to get people thinking. And with the rise of white supremacist movements worldwide, with the increasing rise of hatred and neo-fascism, these are horrible things that I'm vehemently opposed to. And I believe that by helping people to see more complex views of the world, by seeing more diverse views of the world, by seeing a world that is peopled by many, as Du Bois said, many different shinings of the sun, that we are doing what we can to try and open minds and expose people to different worlds and different perspectives and different narratives. And so it is so important to engage them. If they're passively participating, they can close off. But if they're actively involved and they're actively engaged and they're starting to emotionally invest and immerse themselves in the space, then you've already made a huge step toward opening people's minds.
Okay. And you, Lenny, why is sharing power imperative to telling stories on social media for cultural institutions and brands, both of them?
I think historically, like, museums started from a legacy of colonization, and a lot of the people whose stories are told in museums didn't have any input into how they're described and how they show up. So social media can be a good way for museums to kind of allow other peoples to share in that power. And I think we did a really good job in starting to shift that by really, like, showing a different side of history. And I think one really good example is, you know, Thomas Jefferson. Like, there was a tweet that went out and it talked about Thomas Jefferson, and then we would counter that with a different narrative about Thomas Jefferson, or a story around the Star-Spangled Banner. And I'm sorry, I forgot the woman's name who made it, but Grace Wisher was a freeborn indentured servant who actually sewed a majority of the flag as well. But she just most recently got into the common lexicon that we talk about when we speak about the Star-Spangled Banner. So I think for me and for our approach, it was really about, like, how do we begin to shift these stories and these narratives that we tell by inviting people in and also just showing a different side of it. And I think for today, as we live in this new attention economy and you're competing with TikToks, right? Like 15-second views, you have to think about how can you show up in a different way to get people excited about what you're trying to share. Because if someone else is doing it in a more entertaining way, they're never going to engage with their institution.
This question is both for the speakers and you, so we can ask it on the application. To continue this discussion, how can cultural institutions act more human with their online participation? So it can be food for thought. So,
I mean, coming out of the universities, and I mean, I think we had this conversation at one point, but I think part of it is it's very easy to detach ourselves from the data, particularly if we don't have an emotional or a direct connection to it. And we see this with the Transatlantic Voyages database, slavevoyages.org. It's a brilliant database. It has a lot of numbers in it. And really the key thing is every one of those data points is a human being. And that's something that tends to outrage me and infuriate me. And I can call up a file from any given slave voyage. So it'll tell me who the captain is from that ship. It'll tell me, because it's all data that's coming from the ship captains. So, but I could go to, like, Bahia, Brazil, and I could probably find you that guy. And I could probably find him in the archives, and I could tell you that he was a stand-up guy, he was a pillar of the community, all the things. And yet on that ship were, say, 427 people, of whom 100 of them died during the voyage. What were their names? Where did they come from? Who were these people? They've been forgotten. And I find that egregious. I find that horrific. It fills me with a whole lot of rage. And so I think it's really important to remember the human inside the scholarly and to remember the tremendous and terrible impact on the human. And never forget that. It has to be right in front of our eyes at all times.
I would say, like, you need to find a voice that feels like it's human. Like, I think that's the first part. If you want to engage on social, like, you need to have a personality and have a way to engage with people so that they want to build a relationship with you. But you also need to figure out how do you offer a different way to engage with your institution. And I think oftentimes museums, there's a lot of context. I've spent many hours trying to break down a label into a tweet, but how do you make it more digestible? Like if you have a lot of text, if you have this different side to it that doesn't typically feel social, then people aren't going to engage with you at all. Like it's about breaking it down, making it digestible, making it snackable, making it conversational so that you can build with this new audience.
Okay, we have great answers from you. So, for example, cultural institution can bring out emotions. They can make it about people, tell personal stories, diversify sources, organize online events, interact, create and publish games. So yeah, totally. Many things to integrate. Also, if someone wants to answer directly, you can. We want to have also this panel in a conversation way. So if you have thoughts you want to express out loud, feel free to. And if not, let us compare how you thought about history before and after working with digital media. To what extent did and does working with digital media enlarge your reality as someone who wants to force a debate about history in our society? Who wants to go first? You go first.
Okay, so I think particularly within academia, we hear a lot of talk about how history is dying, or humanities are dying, or they're not interesting. We see the closure of a ton of departments of history. And I think this is really wrong-headed, not just because I have a personal stake in it, but because it's so fundamentally human. To understand where we came from is so fundamentally human. But I think there's a good point that we can pull out of these kinds of conversations, which is that how we're doing history is often not terribly appealing. The old model of, I stand in front of you with a lectern and I talk at you for 2 to 3 hours, and you passively accept that and take notes, and then I will quiz you on those notes and see if you were listening. I don't think this is a successful model. But at the same time, there are so many tools and technologies now that we have available to us to bring these places to life. We see the power, from my perspective, we see the power in video games, absolutely, where we can do better research. We can do better storytelling. As historians, we're storytellers. That's what we do. We tell cool stories about humans doing human things. If I put someone in a game world, there's 2 different angles that I find really, really exciting about that. The first one is, as a scholar, if I am standing virtually in a reconstructed space that's been modeled through archaeological data, GIS, photogrammetry, whatever, but it's about as accurate as it can be got, I may actually derive more insights from standing in that virtual space than I would if I read it in a text. And that's really, really cool. And it may bring me a whole lot of insights as a researcher, thinking, oh my gosh, I hadn't thought about that. And then I fall down another rabbit hole and go wandering off and chat with somebody else. Collaboration, it's the best. But at the same time, that's good for students too, because then students, learners, people in the outside world will step into those spaces, and they can also imagine. It's very easy for us as historians to look to people in the past and forget that they're human, and forget that they have bad days and they're doing stupid things for no reason than because they're humans. Joseph Miller, who was a good friend and a scholar of Angola, once told me fairly bluntly, history's messy. And it so is, and that's what's kind of amazing about it. And that's what's kind of beautiful about it. And when we put people in those digital spaces, that's when we can really touch the fundamentally human nature of these things.
I think showing up in unexpected places, thinking outside of like the typical spaces where museums show up is important, because it just allows you to develop a relationship in a new way. For us, that meant sometimes partnering was someone that was unexpected in a museum or the cultural field. It could also mean that we were running down the street to visit Facebook and helping them test out some kind of digital video game. So for me, it was always about, like, how do we continue to push and just invite in, and I'm going to keep saying that over and over because that was really crucial, I think, to what we did, but inviting people who just typically don't engage with museums, and that meant showing up so many different places. It means hosting block parties at the museums. It means inviting photographers in who were had really great profiles on Instagram to share their own interpretation of our imagery and what it looked like through their own unique lenses. It also meant hosting a variety of different speakers and topics that really ignited discussion and making sure that that was available and participatory through streaming and live tweeting and just showcasing the full life of it. So, whether you were just scrolling on Instagram or you saw a tweet, there was a lot of different ways for you to engage with us.
Okay. My next question is, will modes of cooperation, the process of working with digital media, and the nature of digital media in terms of telling history change analog ways of thinking about history? And it's also a question you can answer if you want. That's a tough one.
I mean, I think that's where that concept of immersion comes in. The example, and it's a human thing, it's like a digital thing, but a human thing. The shout out that I give to Tom Hurlbut and Scott Nichols for introducing me to him, that reenactor guy, there's a story that I like to tell because I think it's a really interesting, I never thought about that moment. I'd talked to a lot of maritime historians, and so Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, sailed out of Sierra Leone, and he actually took Bunce Island in 1721. And so we have a record of that, which is a really interesting archival record. We know that he took 3 ships to do it. When I started looking at the satellite data, so here's where the digital starts to come in, I looked at the satellite data because I thought, well, I've got to recreate this in the game. I mean, this is too cool not to. I could see sandbars. So it's like, oh, okay, so there's only certain bits of the river that he could have possibly gotten his ships up. Okay, that's interesting. So I reached out to my friends, and I was connected up with this maritime reenactor, Tom Hurlbut, who had actually sailed these kinds of things. And it was fascinating because of this digital desire. I learned a whole bunch of new stuff. And he was explaining how when you're besieging a static thing, your goal is to run them out of ammo, which makes perfect sense. So you're doing false actions, you're sailing in and out, you're trying to trick them into losing all their ammo, which I know from the archival account is exactly what happened. They ran out of ammo at the fort. And to the point where the chief slave trader, Plunkett, was putting iron bars into the cannons because they'd run out of cannonballs. And what Tom described to me was how you listen to the rhythm of the gunfire. And I'd never thought of that because I'd never done that. And he said, if it's a fast tempo, they've still got a lot of ammo. But if it's a slow tempo, you know they're running low or they're faking you out. And then it's like, well, if it gets staccato, maybe one of their cannons exploded. And I was like, oh my God, I never thought about history this way. This is so interesting. Now I've got to build like some sort of, I don't know, rhythm dance game into the game. Because
add it to your list.
Right? It's insane. It's so cool.
I think for me, it was a way to take back power. Like when you can share a story that hasn't been told before and people can see themselves in that, like it was the most powerful thing I think I probably will ever do in my career, was being able to amplify those stories through social. And I think today, everyone has these smartphones, everyone has access to social, and you're seeing more over and over that people are like starting to tell their own stories or starting to create TikToks and diving deep into history and etc. And I think museums and cultural institutions need to lean into that instead of leaning away from it, because you just can't compete. And I think one of the things that I used to see a lot was, we would stay very high at the top, and it's about how do we humanize ourselves and how do we allow people to come into this new space. And I think social is the perfect way that we can do that.
And regarding immersive technologies, how do you think XR, so AR, VR, we have a few experiences around there to test. How do you think these technologies can help better sharing history and immerse users in stories?
I think they fundamentally, they directly immerse people. I tend to be slightly reluctant about them, to be honest. But part of that is because I'm always thinking, how will this play in Sierra Leone and on what? And when you're dealing with trying to build for somewhere where there's serious infrastructure challenges, there's serious power challenges, there's cloud challenges, people aren't familiar with the technology, desktops can be a stretch. But I think they have tremendous potential. It's just a case of audience, and I think we have to be very conscious of that.
Sure.
I think that's important. Our museum is historically ticketed, and I think one of the things that I saw was like, this is an online system? Like, what about people that don't have access to the internet at home? Like, how do we make this accessible? And I remember being a person in a room full of very big bosses saying, hey, like, we have to find another way to make sure that anybody can be invited into this space. And they added a phone number, which is a very simple solution. But also, like, how can we start to redefine, like, what the role of a museum is? Like, what the role of a museum is within not only culture, but, like, in the historical canon, I think is a really good way to think about approaching social.
Okay. I think we can keep the last 15, 20 minutes for a Q&A session. There's an anonymous question, but if you want to say it out loud, you can. And if you have a question for our panelists, you can take the mic and say it. Don't be shy.
We have one on
Should we answer the question
like
that's on the screen?
Yes, alors, sorry. Sorry. So, you've both mentioned the importance of citizen historians, telling the stories of real people or using them as detectives. Who else does this well, in your view?
I'd say elders, but are elders citizen historians? I mean, I feel anybody with a story to tell does this well.
I think, well, I guess Humans of New York is not history. Let me think.
It's a really good question. We're both thinking.
I'm trying to think of a good example.
So the anonymous questioner asks, you've both mentioned the importance of citizen historians, telling the stories of real people or using them as detectives. Who else does this well, in your view? Yes.
You just exposed us really great, fantastic examples of how to communicate with different people. But for me, it's a big question how to build the communities at the distance. So how did you get to these people and talk to them and explain to them the importance and all the stuff around?
In terms from like a social strategy perspective?
Yeah, in terms of all the perspectives.
I think what was important for me as I was building it out was to build trust within the leadership team. So social typically is not something that always has a seat at the table. And I think it's important that when you're trying to find an approachable way to talk to your audience, that you have buy-in all the way at the very top. If you don't have it, you may be forced to post things that aren't typically important for your audience, or to show up in a way that's about giving or donations, which doesn't typically work well in those kind of spaces. So I think it really just starts with building a good relationship and then finding out like what your voice is. what do people want? Again, we use surveys all the time to figure out like what people like and what they wanted, and then we took that and adjusted our strategy as needed. We also had what I called like a living document, so it was something that we could adjust over time. It was nimble, and you know, when the platform called for it, we switched, we changed. And I too think too often, I mean, back in the days you could like do one post and it could go across multiple socials, and today it's so important that you have to show up differently on TikTok, you have to show up differently on Instagram, Twitter, whatever they're calling it now, versus Facebook. Like all of those different social platforms need to have a unique voice and a unique way to engage with your audience. And I think, unfortunately, sometimes museums aren't equipped to have teams that can do that in a way that's really well. So one of the other things I would say is like, invest in your social people, for sure.
Can you just, in a couple of words, sentences, explain what sort of audiences are like represented, or what the communities are like?
On each platform?
Yeah.
Yeah. I just did this Wednesday for work. TikTok is a place about discovery. It's a place where people can find different communities based upon things that they're passionate about. So whether you are a person who loves to watch frogs hopping around all day, or you love to watch knitting, there is a space in the community for you on TikTok. I think Twitter in its height, in its prime, I'm gonna cry about Twitter and what's happened to it, but it was a space where communities were able to find their power and their voice, whether that was through the Arab Spring or through hashtag Black Lives Matter. People were able to find themselves and connect, and they were a really powerful force. And I think Twitter, I would say, is about just bite-sized information around different topics. It moves very, very fast. There's still not something that's replicated. I missed a few, but it's okay.
So, sorry. So, what other Oh, okay. Sorry, I just got confused. No, mine was just a really quick follow-on, because I saw the museum rap battle coming to the UK, and I was so excited when I saw it. I was like, this is incredible. So I just wanted to know what the impact from your side, like did you track the impact of it? Like, what was what did you get back? Because we, as I said, when we saw it, we were all like, wow, this is so cool. Sorry, I will stop.
I mean, it was like a number 2 and number 3 trending topic the day that it came out. There were some articles from it, but I think what was most important was that people got to see a different side of the Smithsonian. Like, the museums were rapping. It was all to raise awareness for the anthology of hip hop and rap, this giant book in history around rap in the United States that the museum was doing. So yeah, it was pretty successful. I don't remember the numbers. I don't have the numbers on the top of my head, but it was a pretty successful case study. And to me, it really showed like how museums can just break down barriers, and also like really help legitimize hip hop and rap in a different way for people who probably had never thought about it or engaged with it before, because the Natural History Museum was rapping on Twitter.
I wanted to ask about the more problematic aspects of historical representation. I think it's especially a question to you because of the video game representations. Because I think in video game representations or in VR apps, we're gravitating towards the good old-fashioned as it really was, right? And I think video games can be even more suggestive in this respect than movies, for instance, right? We're used to mistrusting movies. We're not really yet, I think, very well versed in mistrusting VR images with a caption, "This is a very accurate reconstruction," and even the buttons or suspenders or the rhythm of the guns is accurate. Right? And historical reconstruction is very much, or the reconstructionist community is very much about the as it really was paradigm. So are there any ways of introducing this kind of fuzziness or a kind of critical impulse into what you're doing? Because if you're just dealing with documents, for instance, if you're dealing with photographs, we know how to interrogate them. We know how to see the things that are not shown. The problem with, especially with a 3D environment, is you can look at everything. Nothing is hidden. It's all exposed, and you're told it's all accurate, right? So there is hardly any room for criticism. How do you deal with this?
That's a great question, and that's something my team and I actually debated extensively. One of the things that we looked at was, if we're reconstructing Bunce Island as it is today, then we can be pretty certain that we've got the photogrammetry, we've got all of this data, and we're presenting it as transparently as we can. But, this is the big problem, if we take you back to the 1720s, and we're seeing the Royal Africa Company in charge of Bunce, now we have a big problem, because all of the maps that we have from that time period are aspirational at best. So even what's in the fort is a mug's game. It's like, there's drawings that tell us that there were buildings. And when I've talked to the chief archaeologist, he's been like, yeah, there's no foundations for those buildings. I'm like, oh my God, really? And it's like, all right, so, okay. So we have the ledger books from 1721 from the Royal Africa Company that tell me that they had a blacksmith on staff. So that means there must have been a smithy there, somewhere. Not quite sure where. So one of my grad students is actually a living museum blacksmith. And so I took him to Bunce Island in February and was like, okay, here's the blacksmith, man. And that was a problem. So one of the solutions that we've come up with is to stylize. So where we can say this is for realsies absolutely what it really is right now, cool, we'll photogrammetry that. When we're making it up, bottom line, to the best of our ability, the best thing we can do is to be absolutely transparent about that. So if you're walking through Bunce Island circa early 18th century, those buildings are going to have a clear stylization, and that's where working with the creatives in Sierra Leone, working with, we've got Kenyan collaborators as well, and it's really important to us that our creatives that we're working with are from sub-Saharan Africa, because it shouldn't be a Eurocentric or a North American artistic vision of what this should look like. Ideally, it's a Sierra Leonean vision. And so that was one of our key things, is if we actively and explicitly stylize the bits that we don't know, or we're kind of guessing as much as we can, but we don't have enough data, and we're making it up, then I think the only thing to do is to be transparent to the player and say, it's our best guess, we're doing our damnedest, but I'm not really sure where that blacksmith was. It's somewhere.
Thank you all for this really wonderful kind of panel. I was curious in terms of your approach in terms of social. You brought up the power that existed on Twitter with the Arab Springs, with Black Lives Matter. I can see how that can kind of like bring a huge amount of people to that discussion. I'm wondering what your experience was when you were going further back and pulling back history that wasn't of like, let's say, I'm not going to even say history because it's not history; it's still happening, in many ways. What was the numbers, for lack of a better term, in terms of I could see what resonated now and what's resonating from the past, and what you might find as a challenge in order to kind of maybe even out those numbers.
I think I'll say this. I had incredible trust with my director in order to push certain topics. So there was an incident that happened outside of Washington, D.C. There was a white supremacist march, and a woman was killed protesting against that. It was a highly contested topic. It was trending on Twitter, and I thought our role as a museum should be to add some historical context to this conversation. So very quickly, I worked with our curators to pull together a thread. I think it's still up. It's called the historical implications of white supremacy or something like that. And we went all the way back. We did a thread and we responded and we posted it that same day, and it went viral. And people were excited about us being in the moment and being able to do that. Another funny story is I was on my way home, so I lived in D.C., passing the Capitol. Nicki Minaj tweeted something about Nicki Minaj, if you're not familiar, is a rapper in the United States. And she tweeted something about Harriet Tubman. And it was end of my day, and I was like, oh gosh. But it was bothering me because I was like, we should jump into this conversation to correct Harriet Tubman's legacy. So I very quickly pulled together some graphics, and we tweeted out some more information about Harriet Tubman because she was now a trending topic in order to make sure, again, that we were adding the right historical context to that conversation. And I think we were able to do that successfully over and over again, whether it's about Independence Day or during Black History Month or just whenever I could find a way to like offer a different narrative or counter it. We jumped into it, we weren't afraid, and we did it, and it was very successful, but it took a lot of trust and a lot of care between the people, the really smart curatorial team and myself in order for us to be able to do that.
Right. Any more questions?
Hi, just want to ask, because you talk about building a social network team in a museum is a very important thing. How many people do you think a museum need, and how to arrange them? Yeah.
So I was the very first social hire at the Smithsonian. I also was one of the most senior. I was the most senior social staffer at the Smithsonian Institution. With that, I was able to create a model for other museums to follow. I had a team, at its high point, I had a team of 4 people that were all dedicated to social media. I had someone who just worked on Instagram, and like she was more historical, so she helped research and work directly with curatorial, and someone else that was just did a lot of our public program and make sure that we were live and like we were updating on Instagram stories, etc. So I think what I saw, like especially that I'm not sure what the climate is like now. I'm seeing more people. I still have a few friends that are in the field, but we just have underinvested in social as institutions, and it's a disservice because, and this is in part of my work in brands now, if you're not investing in building communities and relationships, this new generation will pay you dust, like period. So I think like whatever you can do, there's data points. I was, saying like, in order for us to be the best, we have to invest, period.
There were a question? No? I saw you.
Yeah, it kind of connects to what has been asked before, because I wanted to ask you what you would tell other institutions. Like, when you jump into current issues and current debates, I don't think that's something that comes naturally to a lot of institutions, especially when they're dealing with history and historical topics. But what would you say would be like preconditions for them to be able to do that? What do they need to bring into the game to successfully engage in current debates and not have that something that's coming back to them in a negative way that might impact them or their institution in a negative way?
I think it's hard to determine if it's going to impact the institution negatively or not, but you need to have receipts. I think it's random for an institution to jump into a conversation that they have, frankly, no reason to be in. But if you have been engaging with smaller communities, if you've done the work, then I think you can find a distinct way in. And I would just encourage anyone who wants to do that to work with your curatorial team to develop a point of view of whatever you want to discuss, and make sure that it then is bite-sized for social media. Oftentimes, I think I've probably made a few people afraid. Sometimes they're the kind of conversations that we wanted to have. But overall, people loved us for it. And they trusted us. And they really loved when we were able to become part of that conversation. I think especially now in an area of disinfo that we're seeing across social, it's crucial for people who hold this cultural knowledge to be able to say, that's not it. This is actually it right here, period.
Okay, do we have a last question? Yeah.
Well, actually, I hope it's not the last one. I'm curious, how did you deal with, which I'm assuming you got, racist and denial and revisionist comments? What was your policy?
Man, so I was talking to them about this earlier, but I was on Twitter before brands were verified. And that meant, like, as part of my role, like, when I started the museum, like, 2012, I would see tons of racist comments every day, over and over again. And one of the things that I worked out with my team, which, full disclosure, it's not applicable now. It's not applicable now, but I would block people left and right because it was a mental health thing, and also just something about just setting barriers. So if anyone was sending racist imagery, leaving comments, we would block them. But we also had developed community rules. So if you engage with any of the institutions on social, then you agree to abide by these community rules. So if you weren't abiding by them, then you would not no longer be a part of our community. Thankfully now, with verification, we typically don't see that kind of stuff anymore. And you also have keyword blocking, which was also something that they developed later on. Man, the early days of Twitter were crazy.
Okay, so I think we've done 1 hour. It was fascinating. Thank you very much for all the insights you shared with us all. And let's continue the discussion. If you have other questions, we are available on here during the day and also online on social media. So feel free to add us and ask questions and continue the discussions.